Namaste and welcome to this exciting episode of Sattology, debunking mythology. Sattology means science or truth, or study of truth. Opposite of that is mythology, which means science or study of fake, lie, or imagination. Believe me, Native American history is Sattology because it is coming through traditions and a lot of things can be verified. You'll see a sections on that history coming shortly. Mexican history, we have started working on it. And if you need to support us, join us. You can start helping us out. Mexico is a rich country and Mexico is not poor. Mexico is poor due to geopolitics, not because of country. It's a very rich country. So I have a very special guest today, my very good friend, Combe Carpentier. So let us welcome Combe Carpentier. Welcome, Combe.
Namaskar.
This time I did not kill your
Greetings.
name now. I'm fluent now, right?
Yes, quite.
Okay.
No hesitation.
No hesitation. And because I've been practicing your name, mantra and your name. So coming to the European version of India, just a European viewpoint of India, and then we come to our main topic of discussion today. So because I literally feel that they think that India is just like a municipal corporation of, I mean, many countries won't know that municipal corporation of Mumbai is bigger than the entire economy, is bigger than the entire state of Pakistan. And that's a municipal corporation of Mumbai. And their budget is more than the entire state of Pakistan. I don't know how Pakistani army gets paid, or I have no idea. So tell me why the Europeans view India in a different way, or the West.
It is all about the legacy of history. The fact that Europeans for centuries were used to seeing India as a colony, which was, of course, a very hot country with a lot of jungles, deserts, high mountains. And therefore, it was a country which had great handicraft and wonderful spirituality, and also very wealthy Maharajas. That remains for many people the romantic popular view of India. But of course, in the last decades, it has been further influenced by the impression of great poverty and misery and inequality, which has been abundantly talked about in the media. So people who read the major newspapers or watch TV are often treated to views of great misery and destitution. It's beginning to change. And now you are hearing and reading more and more reports about India's rapidly growing economy. But it is always colored perhaps with, prejudice of Western superiority. The feeling of Western superiority that somehow, yes, India is making great strides, but it has great inequality, there is great corruption, and the case of Adani is being used as an example of what is wrong with rapid growth of certain Indian corporations. And along with that comes the general impression of a very stifling bureaucracy. Anyway, all those stories, you know more than I do about that, so I won't go into details, but that gives you a sense of why Europe has great trouble changing its image of India.
Yeah, coming to the Trilateral Commission, and you have sent me the article, very interesting article. And so, we know that today we saw that India taking tit for tat action against United Kingdom High Commission and security of High Commission in India. Even the name is also very funny. High Commission, High Street. It's the same thing. High. Both those of them are high. So what is this Trilateral Commission, and what is this commission planned to do, or what is it meant for?
The Trilateral Commission is part of the system of international institutions set up under the auspices of the Rockefellers, the Rockefeller Foundation, and several others which are connected with it. Originally, the Rockefellers began to build their empire on a Pan-American scale in the late 19th century. And by the beginning of the 20th century, they realized they could expand their power to the Western world, and through the Western world to the rest of the world, since the great colonial powers of Europe controlled much of the other continents. So the American vision of a liberal, what was at that time understood in the concept of the period as a liberal international order, run by or under the influence of the major, mostly American, but also British and West European corporations. That concept matured and evolved over the first 50 years of the 20th century and benefited from the outcome of the two world wars, which saw the defeat of rival powers, Germany, but eventually also Russia, because the Soviet Union, by creating a different system, in a way became closed to much of the rest of the world. And as a result, the American supremacy, which went together with the concentration of economic power in an oligopoly, not quite a monopoly, but almost, which was symbolized by the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve Bank, which, as most people who have done a little bit of research know, especially nowadays, because of all that's being discussed about the American financial system, it is known that the Federal Reserve is not a government institution. It is, in fact, a private cartel of major banks which got together in order to control the American banking industry and thereby the American economy and, of course, American politics. And at the apex of that structure was the consortium of the Rockefellers and a few other great fortunes, primarily in America, but also in Europe. And after creating the Federal Reserve in 1910 and then having it incorporated by an act of Congress in 1913, just before World War I, then they went on to think of what could strengthen their power. And one of the results during World War II was the creation of the United Nations, which was also spurred and in a way organized by the same very powerful lobbies and institutions funded by the Rockefellers and others. And that's why you had the San Francisco Conference, and that's how Rockefeller offered some of his land in Manhattan to build the UN headquarters. So in that way, the US would actually control the UN because it could allow or deny access to foreign delegations. And it could monitor and orient the discussions and the resolutions according to its own preferences. So that was essentially the model of a new liberal empire, which was no longer a colonial empire in the classical sense, as Britain and France and other countries to a lesser extent had. This was a new model of American so-called liberal democratic empire. And clearly that model gradually brought a large number of institutions either under its fold or actually created them. And first you had, not first, but among the first you had the Council on Foreign Relations, which was meant to be a sort of a stable of brain trust, as we would say later, for American foreign policy, influenced obviously by the Rockefeller interests and ideas. Let's not forget that among the people who were groomed by the Rockefellers, you have Henry Kissinger and many others. And then, of course, in 1973, if I remember right, was the year of creation of the Trilateral Commission. The Trilateral Commission was a consortium of very high-level people from both the public and private sector, but the private sector clearly dominant, which gathered the three centers of Western liberal power: the United States, which implies Canada in a way, Western Europe, spearheaded by Britain, so the Anglo-Saxon powers, and Japan, which was a vanquished power and which therefore could be used as a platform through which Asia could be decisively influenced. So this was the Trilateral Commission in its first incarnation. It is, some economists called it the three whales, because they have the American whale, the European whale, and the Japanese whale. And all these three together had the greatest part of the global economy under their effective management. So that gave enormous power to the Trilateral Commission and the institutions and people who were and are behind it. Now, I remember when I was traveling between Europe and America in the 1990s, I mean 80s and 90s, I did meet the director of the Trilateral Commission in the US and the director of the Trilateral Commission in Europe. And I also knew the historic chair, I mean, European chair of the Trilateral Commission, because there are three chairs, one for Europe, one for the US, and one for Japan. And, you know, when you meet those people in their offices or in more informal circumstances, they are they don't speak much. They are very nice. I mean, there's no question that, you know, they are Polish people. But they are clearly given a job of protecting the supremacy of the West, which at that time and even today primarily implies the supremacy of the United States. And behind the United States, you have the so-called Five Eyes, the US being one of them, and the other four being the four major Anglo-Saxon powers, Britain, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. New Zealand being an honorary member because of its English identity. So that tells you that the powers that have been managing the world through the Trilateral Commission and allied organizations like the Bilderberg Group, and you can name several other institutions, because since this is you know, boxes within boxes, and you don't want to put everybody in the same box. So you have several boxes, and people are in a way operating in various contexts and in various frameworks, but there is a coordinating entity behind it. And one of the primary fora, which became more and more prominent in the last 30 years, is the Davos Forum, so-called World Economic Forum. Now, Davos was set up by a German who had become Swiss and who had Nazi roots in his family. But of course, you can't blame him for that, because most Germans had Nazi roots in the 1940s, 30s. But the fact is that you know, Mr. Schwab, who is the founder and the executive chairman at 82 today of the World Economic Forum, he has been entrusted with the job of essentially unifying, or at least synchronizing, and the world economy, and making it a coordinated policy, making a coordinated policy for the economy and the policy, the polity of the future. How will the world look? How will it be run? And that is what is called, what they call the Great Reset. The Great Reset was being announced and discussed for at least 20 years, if not more. And about 10 to 15 years ago, the Rockefeller Foundation published a number of papers about what they expected the world to go through and what they expected the world to be like. And one of their predictions was about a great pandemic, which would force humanity to go through a series of very drastic steps, such as mass lockdowns, mass vaccination, and a number of other restrictions on public freedom, which would be necessary and required to usher in a new world order. The new world order that George Bush father mentioned when he prepared to attack Iraq in the first Iraq invasion. So clearly there was a long-term plan. And it's interesting that among the component parts of this plan was an epidemic or a pandemic. Now, you can say that all this is fortuitous, or that it's just a matter of good forecasting, because something like that was likely to happen. And therefore, the fact that they predicted it shows that they were farsighted. But then again, some other people have taken a dimmer view and feel that this was actually planned and intended, because they felt they needed to really shock the world economy and society in order to bring about the kind of transformation that they want, which they call the Great Reset, which would be run on technocratic guidelines, which are often called green guidelines, sustainable development plans. But then again, there are some real controversies about how sustainable these plans really are, how sound they are, how scientific they are, and whether they are actually for the benefit of most of mankind, or whether they are meant to increase and ensure the privileges of a minority in essentially a very wealthy and very powerful minority. This is now common discussion. I mean, it's not restricted to conspirational websites. It is actually being discussed even in the highest places. It's been discussed in the parliaments of Europe. It has been discussed in the US Congress. It has been brought up in the European Parliament. You know, almost any serious institution has taken notice of this, because you can no longer just deny it and say the only crazy people will go against us because we are doing everything for the best. As a result, the World Economic Forum has become very controversial, and the personality of its president, of its chairman, Mr. Schwab, Klaus Schwab, has been literally under scrutiny. And likewise, the fact that a lot of the inputs for this global plan were forged by people, were provided by people like Henry Kissinger or Zbigniew Brzezinski, who are obviously American policymakers, primarily committed to the global hegemony of the United States. All that makes people feel that this is actually meant to preserve the power of a country and of an elite over others. And it looked like until about 7-8 years ago, there was no credible challenge to that. It was pretty much what the neoconservatives, who are also great forces behind the concept of a global new world order, I mean, a new world order, which they call the new American century, which means they are very affirmative about the fact that no country can replace America. America is a providential nation, and it has a God-given right to lead the world, as they say. Now, lead may sound very positive, but in fact, lead means rule. You know, if you are looking at the German translation for leader, you have Führer. So you know what that can mean. And as a result, what we are seeing in the last 10 years is a growing resistance in many countries and from many people from all walks of life and of all political ideologies, from right to left. But the resistance has become very effective, parting from a few states which have taken a completely contrarian view of the plans for this so-called new world order, a great reset, etc. And these states originally were not so big or so, respectable, because they were seen as outliers who had gone into some sort of a marginal, fringe ideology. One was Iran, another one was North Korea, which can be considered a sort of a holdout of the old communist age. But now you have, of course, Russia and China, and more countries are beginning to establish links with them and actually even join them. The BRICS nations, and now you have several other nations that want to become part of BRICS and of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which are both structures within which effectively the New World Order model is being challenged, or at least questioned, and is not necessarily being embraced. And I think right after the pandemic, which in itself has turned out to be a monumental fiasco because the corruption and the inefficiency of many of the measures that were imposed by the global order, particularly through the Davos Forum and all the consulting organizations that are connected to it, such as McKinsey. Now you can see that this was basically a colossal failure, if not worse. And as a result, right after that pandemic, which has dealt a very big blow, if not a death blow, to a large part of the world economy, you see now the war with Ukraine, which was clearly desired and exploited by the United States and their allies. And as a result, the Western world is in great trouble, and one is beginning to not only question the supremacy of the so-called trilateral world, which is essentially the world which operates under the guidelines set by the Trilateral Commission and others. Instead of that, now you are seeing a world splitting into two. And that is what the last meeting of the Trilateral Commission, which took place on the 12th of March in India, concluded. It said that the world that we have known since World War II, which was a world that was essentially globalizing, in other words, coming together, and it was also a deflationary world. It is being replaced by a world made of blocks, which are competing and sometimes fighting with one another, and where technology is taking over, in a sense, from finance, because finance is becoming an instrument of technology, although that goes both ways. But still, the fact that technology and the ability to develop a country or a space, such as China is doing on a huge scale, in a way that trumps the financial world, which was set up by the United States under the philosophy of the New World Order, which was essentially ruled by financial architectures. Instead of that, now what you see is massive projects for developing the planet's surface and creating an infrastructure which is, based on mobility, on communications, but also obviously on military power. So that is the new scenario. And as a result, one can feel that the Trilateral Commission sees itself in great peril, because it is losing its ability to determine the policies worldwide. And it is also being increasingly questioned, and its credibility is definitely being challenged. So what will happen in the next few years, we don't know. What's interesting is that clearly the Trilateral Commission is now, like other Western-controlled institutions, betting on India to join and become one of the supporting forces of the status quo, because they feel that India, with its English cultural and political heritage, and with its naturally open and tolerant society, would be an ally that could help fight the truly dissident countries like China and Russia. And that's where, India's role becomes very critical for everyone, and India will have to very carefully choose its path to keep its sovereignty and independence, and not become another sort of a neo-colonial empire for the Western world, which, after all, still would like to see India as a relatively obedient partner.
So do you think that so I know China has occupied Indian lands, and China has consistently occupied and undermined India's sovereignty by actually occupying parts of India. And this entire war with China, the war narrative with China, because China is the publicly declared enemy of the West right now, especially by the USA. So do you think this warmongering or creating the war fear against India, China, is the creation of the West?
There are indigenous or endogenous factors, clearly. China is a power which regards itself as the heir to the successive empires of the past, and claims that it should regain or retain every territory that was claimed by, say, for example, the Manchus or the prior dynasties, going all the way back to the Tangs in the early Middle Age. So the Chinese have got this perspective, which is obviously not comforting to neighboring states, especially weaker states, because they clearly will expect a relatively obedient or compliant attitude from their neighbors. That is a factor inherited from history and from, you might say, civilizational legacy. Beyond that, there is no question that the West has a strong interest in fomenting conflict between India and China, because it can really hold back both countries and make them more dependent on Western goodwill. I think the Russian diplomats are right when they point out that while Russia would like to see a good understanding between India and China, and a cooperative attitude with an abandonment of hostilities, they also say that the West clearly does not want that, because they feel that India and China being able to work together represents another formidable challenge to Western supremacy. So the truth is in the middle, in the sense that clearly there are issues with China that have to be resolved to mutual satisfaction between India and China. And at the same time, India should obviously not be pushed into a war with China simply because of the Western ability to interfere and to grow problems. For example, there is increasing pressure from the West on India for India to get very actively involved in the struggle in the Pacific, because as we see, there is a huge Chinese push to expand into the Pacific, which for the Americans is very worrisome and even unacceptable. So as a result, they need allies and they would like India to become involved. The question is, India should, of course, make sure that the Pacific doesn't become a Chinese lake and becomes closed to its own economic interest or strategic interest. But at the same time, India should not necessarily take up the cudgels on behalf of other countries to fight China in the Pacific. So there is a very, subtle balance which has to be kept there.
Rightly said, because India is not initiating a war for the simple purpose the West is asking it. But yes, if the China actually starts something, then Indian government will respond with full force. That is for sure. That is guaranteed, I think, with the way the Indian polity and everything has been functioning. So thank you, Kom, for coming on the show and explaining Trilateral Commission, which is very extremely important for people to know, because this is the way the future. When these people, they are the bad actors of the world, and they keep planning something or the other. So thank you very much. And for viewers, please do like, share, subscribe, and let us know your feedback. Namaste.
All the best. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning to all.